Hi, I'm Jeremy Baker with Possum Fork Heritage, and this video is a tutorial on how to fill knot holes and or cracks with epoxy and sawdust. A couple things that we're going to need. One, we'll want to use our glue brush that we've had, not to spread the epoxy, but the glue brush will be used to clean the knot hole out or the crack out that we're working on. We'll have a Dixie cup that you will use to mix the epoxy. You'll have a two-part epoxy, and for the educators and homeschoolers toolkits, you will have this DevCon. This can be picked up at Lowe's or Home Depot, probably, I know for sure at Lowe's. It's a two-part epoxy. You'll need some painter's tape, and you'll also need a popsicle stick or something that you can stir the epoxy in the cup. And then of course, lastly, you'll need your project piece, whatever you're trying to fill with epoxy. For this demonstration, I'll be utilizing one of the Possum Box Kit serving trays that we've made. And on this tray surface, there is a knot hole that I would like to fill with epoxy. A couple of things before we begin. First of all, we need to remove all of this fine sawdust out of the knot hole. We want the epoxy to be able to adhere to the sides of the hole. Another thing is we're going to make a runny mixture. There's two ways to make epoxy. One is you can mix it and put enough sawdust in that it makes a packing powder, maybe the consistency of peanut butter, so it's not really powder, but it's packable. And another way to mix your epoxy is to make it runny. What we don't want, whether we make it peanut butter consistency or more syrupy, we don't want to get epoxy all around the area we're working on. So we're going to take painter's tape and we're going to tape off this area somewhat so that we isolate the epoxy or the area that the epoxy can access. Another thing is on the underside of this knot, so we need to transfer in our mind this knot to the other side of the board. I'll zoom out a little bit. So we have this knot. We know it's in the center of the board. So I'm going to turn this over, and right here is that knot. There may always be a pathway from one surface to the other through a knot. And so we're going to take our painter's tape. Not only are we going to tape around the knot on the surface we're working on, but we're also going to apply painter's tape to the knot directly on this backside so that the epoxy doesn't leak through. So here I've got my painter's tape, and I'm going to simply just apply it onto the knot. I'm going to be sure that it has adhered to the cutting board. And now we'll flip our board over and we'll apply tape around that knot hole on the front. Now on the front side, I'm just going to use 4 pieces of tape. I'm going to get relatively close to the knot hole. And again, all I'm doing with this painter's tape on this side is keeping the epoxy from running out onto the cutting board or whatever surface we're working on. It makes it a lot easier to clean up whenever the epoxy doesn't run and go everywhere. Now, if you are filling a, say a crack, then you will take your painter's tape and you will line the crack as best as possible. Let's say I was doing this joint and I had a gap and I was going to run some epoxy in that joint. Then I would take a piece of painter's tape and I would tape this side of the joint, and then I would tape this side of the joint, leaving a small crack, maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch right there at the joint. And then I would be able to pour or pack my epoxy into that joint and not get epoxy out on the adjacent boards. Now I'm going to take my paintbrush that I've been using for spreading glue and applying glue. I'm not using this for the epoxy. All I'm doing is simply cleaning out this knot hole. And you can see how much sawdust we were able to take out. And now my knot hole is ready for epoxy. Now I have my epoxy out of the box and everything's ready to go. My surface area has been prepped. Not only have I cleaned the knot hole out, but I've also applied painter's tape around the knot hole. I've also applied painter's tape to the underside of the knot hole. I have my resin, my epoxy resin, and I have the epoxy hardener. I have a Dixie cup that I can mix my epoxy in, just a disposable cup. I also have some sawdust, and I have a popsicle stick that I can stir and thoroughly mix my epoxy. You'll read the instructions on your epoxy containers, whatever epoxy you get. This particular epoxy, I will mix 1 part resin and 1 part hardener. So it says I'll squeeze an equal amounts of resin and hardener out into a clean, discardable surface. And so we're going to take the cap off. Now if you're getting these containers brand new, you will need to cut the nozzle. Now my knot hole is very small, so I'm going to mix just a small amount of epoxy, the smallest amount I can get away with. So I'm going to take these 2 parts and I'm going to squeeze out equal parts resin and hardener. I want to take my stir stick and I want to thoroughly mix this epoxy mixture, the resin and the hardener. I want to take my stir stick and I want to scrape the edges of the Dixie cup, making sure that I get all the resin and hardener thoroughly mixed. If you do not thoroughly mix it together, you'll end up with a goopy, soupy mess that will have to be cleaned up. Now with this DevCon, it's the consistency of a thick syrup. Now what I want to do is add a little bit of color to that. And in order to do that, I'm going to take some of my fine sawdust powder. You can see it in the cup there. And I'm going to stir that in. Now you can go as dark as you want or light as you want. The more sawdust you put in, the thicker the epoxy becomes, and the harder to work with it becomes. So now I'm going to scoop a little bit out. As I work with it, I want to scrape it away from the knot hole. And you can see when I do that, I actually open up the knot hole. There's air pockets in that knot hole that prevent the epoxy from draining down into the knot hole. And so I want to work this epoxy back and forth to ensure that the air can rise to the top as little bits of epoxy drain down into that knot hole. And then my knot hole will be thoroughly filled. I'm going to pack it in and try to push that air out as I move it around. And now what I'm going to do is scrape as much of the excess off. This epoxy is already starting to firm up and set. So I'm going to take that off and put it back in the cup and set that to the side. Now I'm going to let this cure, and according to the instructions on this DevCon epoxy that we are using, we need to let it cure for about an hour. Okay, now we have let our epoxy cure according to the instructions on the epoxy containers. And so we have a hard epoxy mixture. I'm going to go ahead and remove the tape. And as we remove the tape, we'll pull up some of that epoxy with the tape. some of the tape may actually stay underneath some of that hard epoxy. But whenever we sand, see like that piece of tape there snapped off? Whenever we sand down our epoxy, we'll remove that tape. So that's what the epoxy looks like after it's cured out. We're going to take our sanding block, sandpaper, and we're going to sand this epoxy down. Now we don't want to sand, you may have sanded your adjacent surfaces already, so be very careful. Try to minimize how much you sand. I'm going to use an 80 grit sandpaper, and I do not want to scratch up the adjacent wood surface very much, so I'm going to sand in a very specific area here. Now we'll keep sanding through all the grits, starting with 80. I'll go down to 120 and then down to 220, and I will ensure that as I sand, my epoxy surface is even and level with the adjacent wood.